So before I start, I'm honour-bound by my publisher to once again remind you who weren't here this morning about the book. There's a whole pile of them. Some of them did go at lunchtime, so thank you to those who made the purchase. So there are copies of the book, and I'll be very happy to sign them afterwards. $19.99, a bargain. Okay, so I'm going to change the subject a little bit by talking about the Irish suffrage movement, which is something I've been researching for a long time. And I have to say, I'm really pleased that there's been this focus on the suffrage anniversary, 100 years, Vote All 100, or Vote All Acada, I think is probably what it should be more accurately called. There's been a whole range of events taking place this year to mark the 100th anniversary of Votes for Women. And I'm really happy that that's happened. I understand what Ewan is saying, that we shouldn't read the suffrage movement through the nationalist lens. And in my work over the last 20 years, I've really been very keen not to do that and to see the suffragists as actually a movement that was very critical in many ways of the nationalist movement, rather than in any way being seen just as part of the nationalist discourse. Okay, so I'm going to start off by showing you a picture of, this is also the cover of the book, just as a little reminder. So this, this is Margaret Connery, who's one of the best, in some ways one of the most active suffragists, but perhaps also one of the least known. And I think there are, again, a few suffragists that we could name. And I don't mean the Pankhursts, I mean some Irish suffragists that we could name. She's probably not one of them. But if you do ever happen to have the chance to read the Irish Citizen newspaper, she was an extremely active suffragist who wrote a lot and has left us a whole legacy of literature about the kind of suffrage agenda. And that's what I want to talk about today. Okay, so I'm a sociologist. I should say that I'm not a historian. So I like PowerPoint presentations. So my talk is going to be quite highly structured. So I'm not going to have as many interesting anecdotes as some of the other speakers have had. Now, I think, although I've said it's great that there's all this attention on the vote this year, it is very important that we don't just fixate on the vote and think that the suffragists were only interested in the vote. Because in fact, they had a very broad agenda, and the vote was just one of the issues. They were never a single issue lobby group, and the movement really sought to challenge some of the very deep-rooted attitudes about women and children and gender politics in Irish society. And one of the areas that I've been researching over many years is the way in which the suffragists sought to shine a light on the hidden secrets of aspects of Irish society. And as we know, over the last couple of years, Irish society has really gone through a trauma, and I think that's not an exaggeration to describe it as a trauma, around sexual abuse, for example. And there is this sense of perhaps collective amnesia. We didn't know. Well, the suffragists knew 100 years ago, and they were writing about it 100 years ago. So some people knew, and perhaps they weren't listened to. And if we had had the courage at the time to listen to what they were telling us about Irish society, then perhaps we could have prevented some of the subsequent horrors that went on in this country behind closed doors. And I think it's very important that we have an open discussion about this, and we don't perhaps buy into the collective amnesia and collective hand-washing, which sometimes I feel we're in danger of. So we're at a moment where we really need to discuss some of these very hard, really hard issues. And that's what the suffragists wanted us to do 100 years ago. So what I want to do in the presentation today is to focus in on three key areas. The first one is about the conditions and rights of working women, particularly in factories, but also in domestic service. The second one is about housing conditions, particularly the disgraceful conditions in tenements. And the third one is about the abuse of women and children, particularly sexual abuse. So I'm really sorry, there will be no laughs probably at all in this presentation. This is going to be sad. Okay, so it would be very easy, of course, for us now, 100 years on, to dismiss the Irish suffragists as a group of well-educated, privileged, middle-class women who wanted to vote for themselves and who paid very little attention to the needs or the rights of ordinary working women. We can think, for example, of some of the most famous suffragists who were not only middle class, but some of them were virtually aristocratic. So we don't have to go very far. We've got Constance and Eva Gorbooth in Sligo. And of course we have just down the road here in Castletownshend, we have Edith Somerville and her cousin Violet Martin, who wrote under the name of Ross, as you all know. These women who were very active suffragists, very courageous, I'm not in any way undermining their achievements, but you could argue that they had very little contact with working class women, particularly when they were growing up, with the exception perhaps of their own servants. Nonetheless, having such a background didn't make them insensitive to the plight of the working class, and we can see that especially with somebody like Eva Gorbooth, who really stuck her neck out for the working class, especially in Manchester. Now, there was division amongst the suffragists, so I think it's important that we don't just see it as a kind of simple, homogeneous group. There were lots of different splinters, different political groups amongst the suffragists. Some held quite radical socialist views and very much looks to James Connolly, for example, as their kind of inspiring thinker. And those suffragists were very critical of what they saw as a kind of middle-class agenda. However, there were others who, while appealing to working women, did fail perhaps to understand some of the problems experienced by ordinary working class Irish women at the time. Now, these debates were played out in the pages of the Irish Citizen newspaper, and we are really lucky to have the Irish Citizen. It was published between 1912 and 1920. It's a wonderful archive. It's a history of Ireland during those years, but told from a feminist perspective. And it really offers a completely different insight into Irish society. It discusses issues that were not being discussed really anywhere else at the time. Now, my research has been on the Irish Citizen for many years. There is a complete copy of the Irish Citizen in UCC, which is where I did my PhD, in the Bull Library, as well as in Dublin. So it isn't easy to get the Irish Citizen, but it is possible. But of course, my book offers a great summary, so that's all you need to know. You see, I did get a laugh out of you. Good. Okay. So I'd like to start with the first point, which is about the rights of working women, which was a concern of the suffrage movement. So although we rightly think of Irish society at the early 20th century as largely rural and agricultural, there were, of course, pockets of industry. And the Irish Citizen accounts of factory conditions, rates of pay, trade union campaigns, etc., provide an unusual insight into that aspect of Irish history, which has in some ways been understudied. And these accounts go some way to challenging this myth that all Irish women at the time were primarily wives and mothers in this kind of image of the cosy homestead. So the suffragists really challenged this notion of a kind of cosy homestead. So in Belfast, for example, in the early 1900s, there were actually 50,000 women working in the linen industry in conditions that were described by contemporary observers as horrendous. In Cork, the well-known suffrage activist and writer, Suzanne R. Day, she was one of the first poor law guardians in Cork, and she really entered that public life with a clear agenda of social reform for the poor of Cork. I don't know how many of you here have ever heard of Suzanne R. Day, but she was really a very advanced thinker for her time. And she's written a wonderful book called The Amazing Philanthropists, which is about her time as a poor law guardian in Cork. Then in Dublin, we have Cissy Cahalane, who was unusual in being a working class woman who was a leading suffrage campaigner, and she was also a trade union leader, and she passionately campaigned for the rights of working women. And then, of course, in Belfast, we have Winifred Carne. Now, you may be familiar with Winifred Carne as a woman who was in the GPO in 1916, but there was far more to Winifred Carne than just being a campaigner and a supporter of James Connolly. She was also a leading trade union organiser in Belfast, as well as being a very active suffragist. And in 1912, Winifred Carne wrote to the Irish Citizen newspaper to describe for the readers what the conditions were actually like in a textile factory in Belfast at that time. And she said, "Many Belfast mills are slaughterhouses for women and penitentiaries for children." She described how spinning was a very skilled trade, which required a long apprenticeship, alert brains, and nimble fingers. But she went on to argue that despite all of that skill and those years of training, for all that toil in a superheated atmosphere with clothes drenched with water, hands torn and lacerated as a consequence of the speeding up of the machinery, a qualified spinner in Belfast receives a wage less than some of our pious mill owners would spend weekly upon a dog. So she wasn't pulling any punches there. Now, reading the suffrage speeches and writings from the period, it is striking how many of their concerns back then still have resonance with us today, 100 years later. So the issue of equal pay, for example, there's been a lot of talk in the media during this year about the continuation of the gender pay gap. BBC presenters being one case in point, but of course that's, a discrepancy between people who are already very well paid. But we can come right down the pay scale and see that gender pay gap persisting. So this was an ongoing concern of the suffragists, and throughout the history of the Irish Citizen, we see this continual return to the discussion about the gender pay gap. And so, for example, in August 1917, the paper takes the example of teachers to compare how men and women doing the same job with the same training and qualifications were paid markedly different rates of pay. So, for example, on a grade 3, a male teacher was earning £78 a year, which may not seem like very much to us, but for a teacher, £78 a year was a good salary. But a woman on exactly the same grade, with exactly the same qualifications and experience, was paid £64 a year, for no other reason than that she was a woman. So that was considered perfectly normal at the time. Of course, that would never happen now. So we have a quote here from the Irish Citizen, which kind of shows the cheeky humour which often underpinned their social commentary. So I just read this quote to you. It says, "The determined blankness of the official mind on the subject of equal pay for equal work is amazing. The new scheme for the increases of national school teachers' salaries has directed some questions to us. Has there been some recent order overlooked among the multiplicity of such decrees by which the price of food varies according to the sex of the purchaser?" So you will often find this kind of subtle humour in the Irish Citizen. Even though the topics were very serious, many of these authors were quite skilled journalists, and they wrote very, very well. So this issue of equal pay was often discussed at the time under the justification that you could pay men and women different rates of pay because women simply didn't need to earn as much as men. And so we have this proverbial male breadwinner justification. Well, a man needs a decent salary because he's not just supporting himself, he's supporting his family, he's supporting dependents. And the argument was that women were not supporting dependents, women were just working for so-called pin money. And a piece of research was carried out by the Fabian Society in 1913, which actually found that contrary to that argument, 49%, so just under half of women, were actually supporting dependents. And that might have been aging parents, it might have been younger siblings, it might have been children, it might have been a sick or disabled husband. But they were not just working for pin money, and so they needed a decent salary. Now, the other area that the suffragists really sought to shine a light on was that of domestic service. And according to the 1911 census, there were 125,000 domestic servants in Ireland. And so domestic service was the main occupation for women who were working at that time. And they often tended to be very young. Almost half of them were under the age of 25. And you mean they may have been 16 or 17 years of age, living away from home, often as live-in domestic servants. And so they were a very vulnerable and unprotected group, working alone, usually in a single servant household. So, we can imagine a beautiful house like this, which would have had several servants, but you would also have had maybe the local doctor or the local teacher who might have had a single servant working in their house. And these single servants were particularly vulnerable because they were very much on their own in a household, working with the family at the beck and call of that family 24/7. And so the Irish Citizen really sought to highlight this kind of vulnerability to exploitation, but also to highlight the risk of sexual abuse of these young domestic servants living far away from their families under the roof of a male employer. And of course, this was often referred to as the seduction of domestic servants. That was the phrase that was used in the press at the time. And it was often only if the girl became pregnant that the abuse ever came to light. So it came to light really in very harrowing circumstances. And the only recourse really open to the girl was to take her employers to court. But going to court in those days, going to court now is not a pleasant experience, but going to court in the early 20th century for a woman was a really harrowing experience because, of course, at that time, no woman could serve on a jury. So a jury really was 12 men, and good and true, or whatever the phrase is. So it was an all-male jury. Women couldn't practice as lawyers, so it was an all-male judiciary that a woman would have been facing. And so it wouldn't have been unusual for the only woman in that courtroom to be the victim. So a very masculine environment. And the suffragists took the view that women could expect no justice from a legal system so long it was an entirely male preserve. They said in the Irish Citizen, "Is it not time we have a woman on the bench and on the jury when such crimes as murderous and indecent assault receive nominal or no punishment?" And that refers to the particular case of a soldier who got 6 months in prison for almost beating his wife to death with a poker. So very, very low sentences for vicious assaults on women. And of course, in sexual abuse cases, it was not uncommon for the lawyer or even the judge to have told the jury, well, you have to make allowances for men acting on natural urges. So this idea that men can't help acting on impulse was used as a justification in court very, very openly. And the suffrage activist Marion Duggan, who had a law degree but couldn't practice as a lawyer, wrote to the Irish Citizen in 1914 to express her fury at Mr. Justice Dodd, who had said in a seduction case in Dublin that he had instructed the all-male jury to take into account the natural and irresistible impulses animating the man. So he's instructing the jury to take that into account in a seduction case. So the suffragists were outraged that this was going on all the time, and it was kind of not being talked about. It was going on behind closed doors, and it only came to light in these occasional cases where it went to court. So publicising these cases was important as a way of breaking the silence around hidden abuse. And in reference to a seduction case involving a wealthy businessman, the Irish Citizen editorial declared not one word of this case was allowed to appear in any Dublin newspaper. And this is how the press create the legend that there is no sexual viciousness and no danger to young girls in Ireland. And they were writing that in 1913, so over 100 years ago. Now, these accounts, I would argue, in the Irish Citizen are so important, not only because they illustrate the fact that domestic violence and sexual abuse have a long history in Ireland, but also because they illustrate how the courts and the press almost colluded in this silencing, in this covering up that such things were going on in Holy Catholic Ireland. Now, the other area where the suffragists sought to expose this kind of hidden reality of Irish society was in relation to housing. And there was a very interesting two-part article published in the Irish Citizen. It was originally a speech by Margaret Connery, and I showed you a picture of her earlier, from December 1912, which had originally been a speech to the Dublin branch of the Independent Labour Party. And in that, she addressed the issue of tenements. And of course, at that time, we know in places like Limerick, which was vividly captured in the book Angela's Ashes, in Limerick, in Cork, in Dublin, there were numerous tenements where people, whole families were living in one room. And the shocking conditions in those tenements was really a national disgrace. But Connery asked a different question, which is quite a controversial question. She wondered, how can a husband bear to see his wife so overburdened and worried by a crowd of puny children that have to be cared for and fed? And she asked, her article, again, didn't pull any punches. She said, this is a whole family, 10, 12, 13 people, all in one room, most of them perhaps sleeping in one bed, and a new baby is being born every year. And how can a husband continue to inflict that on his wife with no thought for her health or indeed for the well-being of the children? So that was quite a controversial thing to say in 1912. But a suffragist was prepared to stand up at a public meeting and say that. So what the suffragists were really doing was not just saying, oh, give us the vote, and the vote will solve all of our problems. They never believed the vote was going to be a cure-all. But what they were trying to do was to publicise the reality of what was going on, the private abuses, the private sufferings and deprivations. And in so doing, they sought to broaden the public role of women. That women were not just going to get the vote, but women were then going to try to do something about improving the conditions in society. And so the suffragists were really seeking to challenge this public-private dichotomy, that this is public life, and then this is private life. What goes on behind closed doors, we're not going to talk about it. They really sought to break down that division. And so firstly, what they wanted was they wanted the right as women to actively contribute to the public sphere. They wanted to escape the constraints of the domestic realm. They felt that women had a contribution to make to society, and they were going to demonstrate that by the things that they were highlighting that I've just been discussing. And secondly, they sought to challenge what was defined as private, in an attempt to shine a light, to call public attention to what was going on behind closed doors. Okay, so to conclude, because I'd like to allow plenty of time for discussion, I'm arguing, and this has been my body of work for a number of years, is that the Irish Citizen newspaper makes it clear that women couldn't simply rely on men to represent their interests. Now, this was the anti-suffrage justification as to why women didn't need the vote. Women don't need the vote. Women don't need to bother their pretty little heads worrying about politics, because men will take care of them. Men will represent and protect women. That sort of chivalry that men will protect women. And so what the suffragists were showing through the examples that I've given you this afternoon is that men were not protecting women. And in fact, men were often culpable and colluding in the abuse or covering up the abuse that was going on behind closed doors. And so by focusing on these issues, such as exploitation in the workplace and sexual abuse, the suffragists repeatedly sought to show that women could not rely on men to fairly represent them. So women needed the vote and a voice in decision-making to ensure that their interests were adequately addressed and properly protected. So I'll just end with a stirring call to arms, if you like, by Ethelred Browning. She was a very interesting woman. She was an active suffragist here in Ireland of Anglo-Irish background. And after 1918, she actually left Ireland, went to Britain, where she spent the rest of her life working in the area of housing and set up numerous housing settlements of the time. So she became a very important figure in Britain, but she was a very active suffragist here. And so here's her kind of call to arms, where she said, women factory inspectors, women lawmakers, women police, women on the jury, women lawyers, women everywhere. That is the need of our country. Thank you very much.